It is now my pleasure to welcome Gail Toll. She is a generous King David Society member. She's a Women Philanthropy Board member, and she's also involved in our Holocaust Council. So thank you.
Good evening, everybody. As a proud supporter of Jewish Federation of Greater Metro West, we are delighted to gather the King David Society for this special opportunity tonight as we commemorate Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass that took place 82 years ago in Germany. On that night, Nazis torched synagogues, vandalized Jewish homes, schools, businesses, arrested 30,000 Jewish men and sent them to concentration camps, and killed close to 100 Jews. As a child of a Holocaust survivor, it is important to me that we better understand how hate and anti-Semitism is fostered, which is why I'm so honored to introduce our speaker, Arnold McKellis. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, Arno was the leader of a worldwide racist skinhead organization and a reverend of a self-declared racial holy war. Today, he's turned his life around, embraces diversity, and practices gratitude for all life. Arnold will be interviewed by Elise Shane Brown, Director of Holocaust Education and Newark Initiative at Federation. Through both programs, Elise works to ensure that Holocaust education is taught broadly in public, private, and parochial schools throughout the community. The Holocaust Council also offers the Survivor Speaks program and Holocaust Human Interest programming to our community. On a personal basis, I've worked with her recently and have great respect for her impact in our community. Thank you, Elise, for all that you do. Elise, now over to you.
Thank you all so much for being here today and joining with us. And thank you for that introduction. We are so honored to have this opportunity to have this special conversation with Arno before our program begins at 7 p.m. for the entire community. So with that, I'm going to introduce Arno to get us started. Arno, can you share a little bit about your background with us?
Thank you, Elise, and thanks to everyone for being a part of the KDS Society, for tuning in this evening, and very honored to speak with you all and for the program coming up. My background is that of your average Midwestern white kid. I was born in a nice house, nice neighborhood, never went hungry, never took a beating. My parents were together. They both loved me very much, but there was alcoholism in our home, and my father's drinking really made life rough for my mom. And I could sense that growing up. I could sense my mother's suffering, and it drove me to start lashing out at other kids. A big theme of my work is a very simple principle that hurt people hurt people. And of course, fortunately, not all hurt people, but I do believe that anyone who's committing violence or hate on any scale is doing it because of their suffering in one way or another. And my suffering drove me to lash out at other kids at a very young age. From kindergarten, I was a bully on the school bus. And I started getting a thrill from lashing out and causing problems, getting like it became an addiction, actually, to the point where I needed to get that stimulation from disrupting normal life. And it, like many other addictions, like a typical kind of substance abuse, the amount of disruption I needed to feel the thrill needed to increase as I grew older. So I went from being a bully on the school bus to fights in the schoolyard to breaking and entering to vandalism. By the time I was 14, I started drinking myself. By the time I was 16, I was very accustomed to violence. I had been violent since I was a little kid. I got a thrill of it. It was an addiction to anger people and to repulse people. And hate was just like another part of the rush. To say that I hated society and I hate the government and I hate cops. And I found that the more I was able to like direct that hate, the more of a thrill that I got from it. And I don't think there's ever a good reason to hate people or to hurt people, but I think my reason was particularly poor in that it really, the reason that I got involved in white nationalism was for kicks. I got involved in white nationalism because it pissed people off. And I had a lifetime habit of pissing people off, and all of a sudden I'm presented with the swastika and the story that I'm a white man fighting for his people who are in danger of extinction at the hands of this evil Jewish plot to kill all the white people on the planet Earth. And as ridiculous as I know that sounds to all of you, and as ridiculous as that should sound to any thinking person, to 16-year-old Arno, it was literally music to my ears because I was exposed to that ideology through white power skinhead music that carried this message in all the lyrics. And the music was fast and aggressive, and it definitely struck a chord with me just in the structure of the music. But the lyrics were a way of practicing that hate every time I heard one of these songs. I had been in punk rock bands for a couple of years beforehand. I don't have a lick of musical talent, as anyone who is so unfortunate to hear any of my forays into music will rightly tell real quickly. But I was good at screaming really loud and getting people crazy. And very quickly, my friends and I started our own white power skinhead band where we made the same kind of music with the same kind of lyrics. And that band was like a magnet to draw all the other pissed off white kids in southeastern Wisconsin to our group. And it grew very quickly, and we drew attention from established white nationalist groups throughout the United States. And our group went from just a local gang to becoming part of a organization that would grow to be the largest organized neo-Nazi skinhead group on the planet Earth. Right about the time I was leaving in 1994 is when it reached that peak. I got involved in 1987. So I spent 7 years of my life in white nationalism. It was exhausting from day one. But again, with those parallels to substance abuse, the exhaustion was like a hangover. You know, you feel horrible from drinking so hard the night before, but boy, was it thrilling. Boy, was it fun. And rather than deal with the hangover and think about the consequences of drinking, I'm just gonna find another beer. And that was very much how I interacted with that ideology. I knew what I was doing was wrong. I knew that it was wrong to hate people and wrong to hurt people. Growing up, one of my closest friends was a Jewish kid I was in Indian Guides with, Dean Kaplan. And his father, Stan, was a very respected scientist and teacher. And Stan and my dad were buddies, and they'd hang out drinking when Dean and I were playing at our respective houses. So it wasn't that the suburb I live in, Mequon, is very well-to-do. It's predominantly white. It's very conservative, but there's always been a big Jewish population in Mequon, and I grew up around a ton of Jewish kids. I went to more bar and bat mitzvahs that I could count. Always had a lot of fun when I went. So it wasn't like, and again, there's never a justification for anti-Semitism, but it wasn't like I had a bad experience with Jews that led me to hate Jewish people. It was just the thrill I got from repulsing civil society. That I knew why the swastika repulsed people. I wasn't ignorant about the Holocaust, but I again, like a heroin junkie knows it's wrong to prostitute themselves for a fix of heroin. I was the same way with that swastika. I knew it was wrong, but I got a thrill out of putting it out there and just flashing it to the world and watching everybody run, or watching everybody hate me, or watching everybody lash out at me.
So Arno, that's so interesting that you say that, because given that this evening is Kristallnacht, and we often talk about how, of course, there was Hitler and his hatred and anti-Semitism, but the Germans, many of the German people that joined in the destruction, it was about following their leader and becoming a part of the movement, not necessarily just a hatred or an anti-Semitism of Jews. It might have been there, but it was a bigger piece than that. So do you feel that that was a similar situation for you? Do you feel that it wasn't necessarily anti-Semitism itself, but more of being a part of something?
It was definitely the aspect of being a part of something bigger, for sure. I think that's kind of a basic human need, is to have an identity, a purpose, and a belonging. And fortunately, most of us find healthy answers to those needs. And I was presented with every healthy answer you could imagine. It wasn't like I didn't have those opportunities. I just failed to engage in any of them. So without a healthy answer to identity, purpose, and belonging, I chose a very unhealthy one. And again, it was much more about the thrill and about this sense of mission and grandeur and heroism, actually, as twisted as it was, than any sort of kind of rationalizing a hatred for Jewish people or Black people or gay people or anyone else. It was really just the hate was an arbitrary thing. It was the thrill of being a part of this kind of forbidden by civil society way of thinking. And I to this day, that's a pattern you see repeated in all forms of violent extremism.
Thank you for sharing that. That was really interesting. I also, going off of that, were there actual steps initially on how you became a neo-Nazi? Were there people that got you involved? Were there steps that you think, especially since you were a teenager, that we could look towards with teenagers and young people today to teach them not to do that? Was there something specific?
Not in my case. In my case, it was very organic. I was exposed to the ideology through a band, through music, and the music was given to me by a fellow like punker who brought it back from Chicago after meeting a group of neo-Nazi skinheads down there. So it wasn't like an older person who was already in this movement like came up to me. It was someone who I knew, or a peer of mine, who was like, "Oh my God, you got to check this out," that type of thing. There are, of course, there are groups that have very organized outreach to young people, and in our case, once we got our gang going, we would specifically go to areas in Milwaukee where there was racial tension, and just like throw gas on the fire. To give you an example, there was a desegregation program called 220 that was really just gearing up and in full swing in the late 1980s. And I'm sure the people who put it together did put a lot of thought into it, but it seemed from the outside that they didn't at all. They just said, well, we'll take the Black kids and put them in white schools, and we'll take the white kids and put them in Black schools, and boom, we're desegregated. What that did is it caused a ton of racial tension. The Black kids didn't like being in the white schools, and the white kids didn't like being in the Black schools. And when we knew about that, especially if it was a white school where Black kids were being bussed in, we would litter their surrounding neighborhood to the school with horribly racist flyers with swastikas and racial slurs. And now the white kids at that school either had to get beat up by the Black kids or come running to us. So we would like strategically create havoc that would cause our intended demographic we're trying to recruit to come running to us. And that was something that we engaged in all too often. But in my case, it wasn't, again, it was almost pure happenstance that I just happened to come across it.
And in those cases, did you have run-ins with the law, or did you find that because it was sort of, you were feeding the tension, but not necessarily engaging? How was that situation in the 80s and 90s with law enforcement?
For the most part, law enforcement was extremely hostile to us. I learned really quick not to cock off the cops, because I saw friends get their hands broken by billy clubs. I saw a lot of my friends get the snot beat out of them by police officers. They were not fans of ours. There was a number of actual criminal cases where we watched law enforcement officers lie on the stand in order to bolster a point in a case they were trying to make against us. So, and that all fell into the narrative. The narrative was that we had the term ZOG, and it meant Zionist Occupational Government. And that's what we referred to any government entity as. And of course, police, being part of the government, were the foot soldiers of the Zionist Occupational Government. So when the cops were brutal with us, and when they would lie in court, like that all just fell right into place. Like, why would they do that unless they were controlled by Jews who were so outraged by our presence as racially conscious white men? Why would our fellow white men treat us that way unless there was this huge ominous conspiracy behind it? And again, as ridiculous as that sounds, when you're a broken, suffering teenager or a broken, suffering any person of any age, that it makes a ton of sense, and that's how people fall into it.
Based on your experience and how you ended up leaving the movement and changing your whole way of thinking about the world and your role in it, do you think there are steps that we can take to stop white supremacy, neo-Nazis, hatred in general?
Yeah, I in a very broad sense, it's hard to hate someone when you're happy. It's hard to hate someone when you're grateful. These are things that just like, it's like oil and water. They just cannot coexist at the same time. And so when we practice, and when I say we, I mean all human beings, if we practice kindness and we make a point of everywhere we go every day of smiling at our fellow human beings and, you know, greeting people and holding the door, just every opportunity we have to practice kindness we do, we're creating an environment that's less conducive to hate. It's interesting because I've been working in counter-violent extremism for the past decade, and I've done so all around the world. And I'm what known as a former violent extremist. And I'm a particular kind of former. I'm a former white nationalist. I have dear friends and colleagues who are former members of ISIS, former members of Al Qaeda, former Antifa, former members of every flavor of violent extremism you can imagine. And there's a ton of, there's far more common threads behind these seemingly different violent extremist groups than there are different ones. And the reason I mention this all is because, to answer your question, what comes to mind is a tenet of ISIS. When ISIS is directing their people, one of the things that a point they kept hammering on is they want to eliminate the gray zone. They want the life and the minds of the entire Muslim Ummah, 1.8 billion Muslims on the planet, to be binary, to be black and white, good, evil, yes, no nuance, no shades of gray. That's why they say eliminate the gray zone. And that's why every violent act that ISIS perpetrated is meant to make life miserable for Muslims and to make non-Muslims hate Muslims. They want those binary dynamics happening. So to me, it speaks to the answer to your question. What can we do? We can create gray zones. We can create nuance. We can create doubt in people's minds. And the way you do that is by touching their hearts. You're not going to do it by barking at them. You're not going to do it by physically forcing them to think or act one way or another. The reason why I was able to leave white nationalism behind is because people I claimed to hate treated me with kindness when I least deserved it. And these people included a Jewish boss who, rather than fire me for wearing a swastika on my jacket into his factory, he said, he's a good kid. He's just going through a phase. He'll get over it. You know, he'll grow out of it. And knowing that his name was Jack Cooper, knowing that Jack did that made it very difficult for me to rationalize hating Jewish people. In fact, the more contact I had with Jewish people, the more difficult it was to really be a rabid anti-Semite. So I had to, like, if things were under my control, I would have as little contact as I could. And what that means is that and I understand this is a different thing for me to say as a straight white, not, Gentile guy who's typically not in a position where he's going to be a target of hate. But the fact is when people are targets of hate, their refusal to capitulate to that hatred and reflect it can be an incredibly transformative thing. And I'm here talking to you today because my boss refused to hate me back. And instead, he demonstrated for me how human beings should treat each other. And in doing so, he put himself in a position of power. It wasn't capitulation. It wasn't like knuckling under to me. He actually made me knuckle under to him, and I'm the one who changed the entire outlook I had on the world, rather than me trying to do that to him.
Thank you so much for sharing that. With that, I'm going to open up the floor to questions. If you could either remain on mute, but if you can raise your hands, as well as you can also put in the chat if you'd like to say something and ask directly a question to Arno, I will be able to call on you. So if there's anybody that has a question. Okay, Scott Krieger, I see you. You can unmute yourself and ask.
Hi, Arno. Thank you very much for being with us today. Congratulations on turning your life around and the person that you are and you know, became. How do you know, as much as your finger is on the pulse of what you see around you and from what your experience was be of hate, in the white supremacist world, how do you gauge what's going on now? You know, where do you see it, you know, these movements going?
Thank you, Scott. It's a great question, and I appreciate the compliment. I always say, I told this to David earlier in the chat, when people congratulate me and things like that, say I'm happy I changed. I always say nobody's happier about it than I am. Every single day, I'm grateful to not be who I was 30 years ago, and that's why I'm passionate about helping other people make that transformation and prevent people from making those mistakes in the first place. As far as the state of hate today, I want to start off by just thinking tactically. A lot of the people I work with nowadays who are in white nationalist groups are military veterans. Military veterans are targeted by white nationalists because they fit they're an ideal recruit. And not just because they have military training, which of course they feel is valuable to them, but some white nationalist groups, I don't even know that they're really aware of this, but so many vets come back from deployment with PTSD and they're hurting and they're broken and they're ripe for someone to come in and try to reinforce this meaning that they lost when they left the service with this hateful narrative. And in working with these guys, I've never been in the military per se. I was a paramilitary. I did a lot of crawling through the bushes with guns and things like that. I don't want to pretend like I've had actual military training, but in order to work with these guys, I have to think tactically. Like I have to have an objective. What are the tactics and strategies I'm going to use to accomplish this objective? And when you're also another scenario that's used a lot in the military is a thing called red teaming. So law enforcement does this as well. If guys are training to do insurgency fighting, they're going to have a unit of their own that's playing the role of the insurgents, and that's called red team. So when you're stepping in your opponent's shoes, that's red teaming. And in the spirit of red teaming, it's really important when we're thinking about the state of hate to understand the objectives of terrorists. Whether those terrorists are from the so-called Islamic State or they're from the Ku Klux Klan, either way, their objective is to create terror. Go figure. It seems elementary. But a lot of us in civil society lose sight of that when we're talking about them, and we run the risk of feeding their narrative that they are lurking under every rock and around every corner, and that they're everywhere, and they're much more powerful than they actually are. That's the entire nature of terrorism. It's what's called a force multiplier. It's a way for a much smaller numerical force to have influence over a superior force. And that's what's happened since 9/11. If you look at any terrorist attack, that's how it works. So when we're talking about hate, we want to be frank about it. We want to be real about it. But at the same time, we want to make sure we're not doing their job for them and feeding the idea that, yeah, they are absolutely everywhere and anyone could be one of them. It's important to me as a tactical sense to have faith in humanity. That's one of my greatest weapons against hate, is to say, like, and it is a weapon because you can imagine for someone to walk into the Tree of Life synagogue in Pittsburgh and just start murdering elderly people, that person is not only destroyed, they have zero faith in humanity, and they want to destroy everybody else's faith in humanity. And so for me, as counterintuitive as this may sound, it actually comes from a place of spite, to where I'm like, you're not going to destroy my faith in humanity. No matter what kind of atrocity you commit, I'm not going to give up on that faith, because that faith is really what's our greatest asset to keep things from making such a major shift to the point of the violence of Kristallnacht, or the violence of the Holocaust. So maintain a faith in humanity with every bit of information you get, and at the same time be real about what's happening. And I think we are unfortunately at a time where an existing hyper-polarized environment, where there was some lurking economic uncertainty, has now been completely cranked up to 12 because of COVID-19. With the pandemic and the economic uncertainty that the pandemic creates, all the unemployment, it's a rich opportunity for anti-Semites to cast Jews as, once again, the bad guys behind whatever horrible thing is happening. And I don't have to tell anybody on this call or anybody in the Jewish community that that's been happening for thousands of years. That's anti-Semitism 101. You find some act of God, whether it's the Black Plague or it's COVID-19 or it's an earthquake, and you blame it on those weird people who just came here from a different place that go to a different place of worship than we do, and you blame it on the other. And tragically, Jews have been the other for far too long in far too many societies in human history. And now we're in a time where I think there's a big danger of that. I will say that all my work with the Jewish community, everybody I've worked with and everybody I know, and I'm not just saying this, I do have a lot of Jewish friends, and I love Jewish culture and humor and all sorts of things like that. But I think as a whole, what I've seen out of the Jewish community is you guys have been doing everything right. Refusing to capitulate to this hatred and reflect it is a theme that I've seen demonstrated by so many brave Jewish people time and time again. And that's been done by the Black community. It's been done by the Latino community, by the gay and lesbian community, like every so-called minority community you can think of. So I think we just need to triple down on that. And the more dire things seem, the more we have to refuse to give up our faith in humanity and the belief that people can change for the better. And to close the thought, I would say something that comes very handy for me is to just be mindful of how this is framed. If we're talking about hate, I want to remind myself that the opponent is the disease of hate and not the human beings who are stricken with it. In the same way that my father's drinking hurt me as a kid. Well, alcoholism is a disease. My father has a disease. It doesn't make it, it's an excuse for drinking, but it means that the disease is what I need to focus on, and not try to associate his value as a person with that disease.
Thank you. I saw another hand up in the chat. Marjorie Feinstein, you still have a question?
Yes, thank you, Arno. You're so articulate. Your message has resonated with us all. I'm wondering, do you get the opportunity to speak to young people, college, high school students at risk? Because that's really, I guess, where someone like you could make such an incredible difference. And thank you for speaking with us.
Oh, thank you, Marjorie. Yeah, high school and middle school has been my bread and butter for about the past 10 years. I'm a professional speaker. I used to keep a spreadsheet with all my speaking engagements in there, and I just like stopped doing it because there's so many of them. But when I quit counting, I had about 300 under my belt. And I'd say of those 300, probably at least half, if not 2/3 of them, were in high schools and middle schools. And I've spoken all sorts of high schools and middle schools all over the world. One of the most diverse high schools I've spoken in was Kubens in Oslo, Norway, which I was kind of surprised by. But I've spoken at all predominantly white high schools. I've spoken at predominantly black high schools. I spoke at B'nai B'rith Youth Organization camp last summer, which was awesome. I really had an awesome time. It was down in Texas. But yeah, I love working with that age group. And honestly, I learn more from, I feel like I learn at least as much, if not more, from those young people than I have to teach. From my experience in schools, I'm a huge proponent of Montessori. And one of the themes of Montessori is that we're all students and we're all teachers. We all have something to learn. We all have something to teach. And that's really been reinforced by my work with people in that middle school, high school demographic.
Thank you. That's where we found you originally, was speaking in middle schools. So
There you go.
So we
Exactly.
thank you for that. Are there any other questions? I'm looking for any hands raised. It's hard. We have so many pages here. Anybody want to ask a question on their own? If not, oh, okay. Hold on. Zev, you can unmute yourself. Cheryl, is that your last name? Go ahead. Thank you.
Are you able to hear me? Does this work?
Yep, I can hear you.
Fantastic. I'm really curious. First of all, thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you for your mission and what you're focused on today. It's really it's a blessing for all of us that you're doing all of this, and
Appreciate
we
it.
couldn't appreciate it more, honestly. And it's such a privilege to meet you. Like, this is amazing.
Thanks, that means a
My
lot.
question for you is, like, what was the turning point? Like, what really happened? Take us back to like that time when you actually like turned, like you actually
Right.
saw like this. It's sort of it's fascinating. Just take us back to that time.
Sure. So the most frequently asked question I get doing this is, how did you change? The one word answer is exhaustion. Like I said, I knew what I was doing was wrong. So I'm constantly suppressing this knowledge of my inner wrongness. And that took a ton of energy. It just sucked the life out of me. The kindness my boss showed me, and I had a lesbian supervisor who treated me like a friend rather than an enemy, even though she knew that I hated gay people. I had Black and Latino coworkers who would give me food when I was hungover and starving at lunchtime. And those acts of kindness just were the straw that broke the camel's back and brought me to a point where I was so exhausted that I was looking for an excuse to leave by 1994 after 7 years of involvement. The reason I needed an excuse was because I was leading this very drastic double life. In the movement, as we called it, I was a big deal. I was like king, skinhead, rock star, war god. I had a very popular band that sold 20,000 records around the world. I had groupies. I was the life of the party. Everybody around the world, people knew who I was and had this kind of fear-based false respect for me. In real life, I'm an alcoholic high school dropout who's too much of a drunk to pay his bills and keep a job. He has to keep moving back to his parents' house. And he has a tendency to drink until he passes out and then piss all over himself. Like, that's who I was in real life. And so the idea of giving up all of this, albeit inflated status, and like facing the harsh reality of the life I had, failed to make for myself was pretty imposing. And I think that's why it took the two shocks of becoming a single parent in early 1994. My girlfriend and I broke up, and I became a single parent to my 18-month-old daughter. And then a couple months after that, after a concert my band had played, a second friend of mine was shot and killed in a street fight. And by that time, I had lost count of how many friends had been incarcerated. And so it finally hit me that if I didn't change, death or prison was going to take me from my daughter. And but I really believe that without all that exhaustion, that second murder could have driven me further into it. Without that sense of exhaustion. And that's why when I talk about an act of kindness, I honestly believe that an act of kindness can literally change the world. Because if you change the course of one person's path, and that means that they're not going to attack someone, they're not going to hate someone, they're not going to recruit other people to hate and to attack, then how many Tree of Life shootings have you prevented? Theoretically, how many mothers are not going to be mourning their dead sons for, who went out and did something horrible and stupid? So the ramifications of one act of kindness is incredibly powerful, and a big driver of my work is to just emphasize that to people. And I'm sure I don't need to lecture anybody in this room about kindness. I'm sure we all have our own kindness practice, but just to remember the value of it and how important it is really important.
I love that. And it's also so relevant to every religion. It doesn't matter.
Oh, absolutely.
Religion.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I love doing interfaith stuff. I'm a Buddhist nowadays. And I'm the token Buddhist more often than not. But I've spoken with, and I've worked directly with every sort of faith you can imagine. I've done a ton of work with the Jewish community, but also the Muslim community, Christians. My last book I wrote with a Sikh gentleman whose father was murdered by a guy from my old gang. So I've had my latest tattoo is actually the first word of Sikhi scripture, which means God is truth or God is one. And then I got, I don't know if I could show this. I do have a Star of David as well. I know in Judaism tattoos are wrong, but I have all the symbols of the world's great religions for exactly the reason that you brought up, because underneath it all, there's that commonality of what a primal basic goodness our human existence is, and something we can be grateful for and connect with.
I have I don't want to interrupt, so we have time for one more question. We have several in the chat that I know, Arno, you are always so gracious. Maybe after I can email you the questions that we didn't get to, and you
Sure.
can give us a few short responses. But one I wanted to end on from Stacy Davis. It was a great question. Have you spoken with Holocaust survivors or had interactions with them, and how was that? So I thought, given it is going into our Kristallnacht commemoration, that was a wonderful question to end on.
That's an amazing question. I work with an organization in Milwaukee called the Holocaust Education Resource Center. That's part of the local JCC here. I also run a program called Serve to Unite, and through that program, we brought 3 middle school classes from schools all over Milwaukee to the JCC to listen to the stories of Holocaust survivors, which I think is so crucial as time marches on and there's fewer and fewer people who witness the Holocaust firsthand. It's really the duty of every one of us to make sure those stories are preserved and to really cherish every opportunity we have to hear from Holocaust survivors in person, which I also did with the school that connected me with you guys. There were some amazing survivors there. Alan Mushkin is one of the soldiers who liberated, I believe it was Birkenau, is something I'll never forget. And I've also been to Auschwitz. I was there in 2015, and it just changes everything after you experience that. And so it's a very central theme of my work, and it's changed the way that I see the world, and I think in a better way. And I think it's part of my duty to help elevate the stories of Holocaust survivors, and I'll continue to do that.
Thank you so much. And again, if I will take down these questions, and hopefully the ones we didn't get to, maybe we can get to later on in the second program. Thank you, Arno, so much for this unique and special opportunity. And with that, I would like to introduce Michael Goldberg to conclude our program tonight.
Thank you, Elise. I am Michael Goldberg, chair of the UJA campaign. Thank you, Arno and Elise, for a fascinating conversation. and Gail Toll for remembering her parents' stories and passing them on to future generations. We shall never forget. In addition to helping our community, Israel and overseas, your generosity as members of the King David Society supports the Holocaust Council at Federation. We are educating Jewish and non-Jewish students about the lessons of the Holocaust. Elise, through the NORC Initiatives program, sponsors student field trips to the Museum of Jewish Heritage. And why is this important? It reminds me of an article in The Atlantic on July 13th, 2020, where Jamel Hill, an ESPN anchor, recounts Deshaun Jackson, who was a Philadelphia's Eagles wide receiver, Hitler moment, and hers, which showed that Black Americans' experience of racism doesn't automatically sensitize us toward other forms of prejudice. And in her article, she wrote, like Jackson, I am Black. And had anyone made a remark trivializing slavery, I would have been incensed. I learned that just because I'm aware of the destruction caused by racism, that doesn't mean I'm automatically sensitive to other forms of racism, or in this case, anti-Semitism. All of us, each of us, are capable of being culturally arrogant. We all have to be more sensitive to each other's plights, and that's what Elise's NORC initiative and what we work toward at your Greater Metro West Federation. We are very happy you're here tonight, and we plan to do more. I hope you will be seeing you all again at the Women's Philanthropy Pomegranate and Lion of Judah event. Can we talk with Lori Gottlieb on November 17th at 7:30? And for those of you who want to join the community's Kristallnacht event at 7 o'clock, right after this, to hear more about Arno's story, please stay on the Zoom. It will be quiet until the program starts, but this is the correct link. Thank you very much for being here.